All right, so welcome everyone to our workshop today on information literacy foundational concepts and teaching strategies. I am so excited to have you all here today to talk about this. As folks that have been to one of my workshops before know, information and literacy is like the primary focus area of my professional career. I really love talking about information literacy and sharing resources and ideas related to information literacy. So I'm so excited to have you all here today with this workshop. As I mentioned, I know we have a wide-ranging audience in terms of some folks from Ohio State, some folks from outside of Ohio State. We have folks that are course instructors. We have graduate teaching associates. We have folks that are librarians. Hopefully there will be something here for everyone. Some folks that are maybe librarians might have a little bit more background in information literacy than others, which is totally okay either way. Again, hopefully there will be resources that are valuable and helpful to everyone, no matter what your position is as we go through today. So my name is Jane Hammonds. I am an assistant professor in the Ohio State University Libraries. I'm teaching and learning engagement librarian. And you can email me at hammonds.73@osu.edu. And I'm definitely happy to talk more about with you about any of the topics that we're going to talk about today. What we're going to be doing today, we're going to think about what information literacy actually means, what the core information literacy concepts, skills, habits are. And then we're going to talk about strategies and activities that you might be able to use to teach information literacy. And I'm going to share a lot of resources. I mentioned this early in that, so since some folks might not have heard this since they came in, there's a lot of links on these slides. I didn't have enough time space to share all of the links with you. So I've shared a bunch of links just now in the chat, but there are so many more links in these slides. So use that first link to go to those slides if you want access to the other links that I have shared throughout the presentation today. All right, we'll pause here, make sure to see if there are any questions before we jump in and talk about what exactly information literacy is. All right, so what is information literacy? So to get at this idea of what information literacy is, I thought it might be helpful to start with a quick activity when we think about someone that we think of, maybe a student, someone that we consider to have good information literacy. What are the things that they are able to do? Like if they're faced with an information problem, a research problem, what are they able to do? And what do they understand? So I thought we'd do this as a Jamboard activity. Unfortunately, Jamboard is going away pretty soon, but it's still available now. So I thought we would go ahead and do this as a Jamboard activity. So there should be, I'll put this one more time in the chat, links in the chat here where you can access that Jamboard. And we'll go ahead and go out to that Jamboard. Get out of here. So hopefully everyone should be seeing the Jamboard. If you haven't used Jamboard before, the easiest way to add a response is to go over here on the left-hand side. You'll see an option to add a sticky note. You can click that sticky note option, type your response in there, and post your response to the Jamboard. So our question here is, think about someone that you consider to have good information literacy. What are the things that they understand? What are the things that they are able to do? That maybe someone who is not information literate or someone who doesn't really have strong information literacy would not be able to do. So I'll give everyone a chance to share their responses there. Excuse me. Just move some of these. They all show up on the same place. So I'm sure we're moving them around so folks can see them. So go ahead and please and continue to add your responses. But taking a look at some of these, I see, the ability to discover information, to find information, right? Seek out information. I see a lot around information evaluation, right? So the ability to recognize when information may be questionable, to recognize relevant, appropriate, accurate information, how to find credible information, critically analyze that information, critically evaluate the sources, right? Apply critical thinking skills, discover information, evaluate it. So lots of responses that are really highlighting that evaluation component, right? So it's not just about being able to find information, but it's about being able to understand that information and being able to say, is this information relevant? Is it accurate? What is misinformation? What is not information? What is really going to be valid information or appropriate information, credible information? So lots of responses around that. And we have some responses here that are highlighting being able to use information, right? So being able to work with information to incorporate information into whatever need or activity there is. So there's some reason someone is seeking information, they're able to actually do something with that information. Consult all the necessary information to answer a question, right? So we see a lot of commonalities with these responses. That information literacy is centered around, having this ability or these understandings that are necessary in order to be able to find information, using different types of information tools. Really important that they're able to verify or evaluate, critically analyze information, and then use that information to do something like answer a question or solve a problem. Great. Thank you so much for sharing your responses there. So that is really helpful to get an understanding of what we're thinking about when we think about what information literacy actually is. And jump back into the slides here. If ever I'm not, if I'm on a page that doesn't look like what it's supposed to be, please do let me know. Sometimes I know it doesn't always follow you where you're supposed to go. So I did want to briefly share for those folks that may be a little less familiar with the idea of information literacy, I wanted to share two definitions really quickly. This first is a definition that was developed by the American Library Association in 1989 and was a massively influential definition in shaping the understanding of information literacy. So they defined information literacy as being able to recognize when information is needed and have the ability to locate, evaluate, and use effectively the needed information. So that was a really important definition. Those folks that are librarians in the audience probably know that that definition was incorporated into the standards for information literacy for higher education, which really guided the development of a lot of information literacy programs across the country. In the past few years, in 2015, 2016, so almost moving actually to 10 years now, which is kind of surprising, the ACRL, the Association of College and Research Libraries, offered an updated and expanded definition of information literacy. So they described information literacy as a set of integrative abilities encompassing the reflective discovery of information and understanding of how information is produced and valued, and the use of information in creating new knowledge and participating ethically in communities of learning. So that's from a document called the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education. So I wanted to pause here to give you a chance to reflect and think. As you saw those two definitions, what do you see as any kind of key distinctions that you might see between those two definitions? And you can feel free to share if you would like to share your thoughts in the chat. What you see as any key distinctions between those definitions. If someone feels comfortable raising their hand, speaking out, you can also feel free to go ahead and raise your hand and share the response that way. I'd love to hear what you all think about the distinctions between those definitions. Mm-hmm. We'll give it just a few more seconds. I know it takes time for folks who want to type their responses in the chat. Yes. So go back a little bit. So here are those two definitions again. A person must be able to recognize when information is needed and have the ability to locate, evaluate, and use effectively the needed information. And then our second is a set of integrated abilities encompassing the reflective discovery of information, the understanding of how information is produced and valued, and the use of information in creating new knowledge and participating ethically in communities of learning. So those then are two definitions. These are not the only definitions of information literacy, by the way. Other organizations, including international organizations, have put forth their own organizations, but I'm just sharing the two definitions that have been really dominant in shaping the understanding of information literacy in the United States context. Right, so some of the responses that we have here. The ACRL introduces the idea of knowledge production and value. Yes, so that second definition, right, recognizes more the idea that students are knowledge creators, not knowledge producers, has that emphasis on value. Teresa shared reflection and understanding. So you get more of this idea of reflection and understanding, more active participation. Katie shared in the second one. Brooke also shared ACL, more active participation, more using the information, right? Understanding and evaluating the source of the information, not just the information itself. Yes, absolutely. Use of information versus theories of information. So Lee shared the first definition seems to be very much on the individual level, while the ACR framework is very much about placing in a broader community. Also, the ethical aspect that is not present in the first definition. Yes, thank you. Yeah. So these are all really great responses. Thank you all for sharing those. Several of the key distinctions that I see in the framework as compared to that first understanding are the ones that you all highlighted. The framework really highlights more the idea that students are not only information consumers, they're also information creators. It highlights this need for deeper understandings about the context in which information is created and produced and valued and shared, right? It has that aspect about ethical, participation in these communities, which could be very broadly defined, and then, highlights that ethical component that's not brought out really strongly in that first definition. So thank you all so much for sharing those. So, for folks that are librarians, may be kind of familiar with this discussion, but the framework for information literacy created a lot of discussion within the library world about what information literacy was, how it's conceptualized. And I see it as information literacy as including three really key components. So it includes those skills or abilities. That first definition, I think, highlighted more closely the idea of information literacy being about skills, find, evaluate, and use information. And that's definitely still important. That's definitely really, important component of information literacy, like being able to use a database, being able to cite sources accurately, those kinds of things. But what I think the framework did is helps to also bring in these other components. That information literacy is also about understanding the factors and the context in which information is created, accessed, distributed, used. So there's a lot of broader things that you have to understand to really develop information literacy. And the framework also really highlights this idea of habits or dispositions. So it's about having patience or persistence or adaptability when you're searching for information. So those are the three big components of information literacy that I like to highlight. As we're going to go through today, we're going to talk a lot more about the conceptual understandings as a key piece. We're going to focus a little less on the skills and abilities. Those are still important, but I think the conceptual understandings, I think, are kind of the new component that really came out with the framework. So I'll pause here to see if there are any questions or comments really quickly before we do take a look at some of these key concepts related to information literacy. Please do go ahead and continue to share any questions or comments that you have in the chat. All right, so I'm going to go back. This is good. So the framework for information literacy highlights 6 core information literacy concepts. And what these concepts basically represent are understandings about research as a process, about scholarship, and about information use and access more broadly that are shared among experienced researchers, but that aren't often explicitly spoken about, or maybe they may not even be recognized. These are things that someone who's been an experienced researcher will probably understand, but may not even realize that it's something that they understand. But at the same time, these understandings influence our expectations for how students will perform when we ask them to do a research project, for example. So what the framework really tries to do is highlight what are those hidden or tacit understandings that really experienced researchers have that a novice learner may not have, and that can create a gap between expectations. To think about this a little bit more, I have a question here. So, why do we ask students to use more than one source? You know, when we give a research assignment, we often tell students you have to have 5 sources, you have to have 10 sources, right? Why do we ask students to use more than one source? So please feel free to share your response in the chat, or again, if someone would like to raise their hand and share, you can feel comfortable doing that as well. Why is it that we have this expectation that students will use 5 or 10 or 15 sources? So we have responses coming in. So Emily shared, understand multiple viewpoints. Yes, absolutely. Alex shared, not every source will contain all of the information. Absolutely. Yes. A couple of responses in there about bias, a way to mitigate bias. Multiple sources to provide verification and support for their research, right? Triangulating sources, gathering academic consensus or argument, right? Multiple perspectives. Yes, absolutely. To realize that sources communicate with each other. Yes, accuracy of information. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Right. Your responses are coming in to gain a comprehensive understanding of the topic that offers both, for and against. So we want students to see multiple perspectives. We recognize that not every source is going to contain one source is not going to contain all of the information that they might need. Sources have different levels of bias, so they can see those different levels. Topics are presented, as someone said, right, covered differently based on the source type. Absolutely, right? All of those are incredibly valid reasons, right? So, as experienced researchers, as librarians, we recognize that there are always going to be multiple people looking at a particular topic. There are always going to be multiple perspectives, multiple arguments. We recognize that findings can vary significantly across studies or across different types of sources. Each individual researcher or scholar or author is going to have their own perspective or interpretation or argument. We know that there's very rarely consensus among academics or professionals in a field on certain topics, right? And we also understand that perspectives can change over time, right? So these are all really great reasons why we ask students, right, to use multiple sources, right? Support evidence and credibility. Absolutely, Maribel. So in other words, right, we recognize this idea of scholarship as an ongoing conversation, right? We think about, maybe not always consciously, but we think about scholarship as a conversation. We know that sources are always talking to each other, right? Authors or scholars are always talking to each other through their work. They're debating each other, they're sharing their ideas, their findings, their perspectives, they're arguing, they're building on each other's work, right? So we know that each source is like a voice, right? It's that author's voice or that group of authors' voice in the conversation, but we know that there are other voices in that conversation. And to really have that comprehensive understanding of a topic, right, and to have that perspective where we can see where bias might exist, we need to see all of those different perspectives, right? And so that's why we can't let our students just use one source to answer their research question, right? Because we think of this ongoing scholarly conversation. We know all of these sources are connected to each other. So with an understanding of this idea of scholarship as conversation, what is a type of assignment that students might struggle with? So what are the kinds of assignments we tend students to do if they don't get this concept of scholarship as conversation? What is something that they might struggle with? If you have any ideas for that, share that in the chat. And I'll mention, like, so, if you're new to the wording of scholarship as conversation, I think in many cases, as experienced researchers, scholars, folks that have been in higher education as a while, hopefully that will still have made sense to you. I know that before I heard it described as scholarship as conversation, this is something that I understood. And when I first heard the term scholarship as conversation, I was like, yes, that's it. That's that it was something that made sense to me right away based on my experience in higher education. So even if you haven't heard that term before, hopefully that is something that made sense to you as someone who's experienced researcher. All right, so some of the things that students might struggle with: critiquing concepts, literature reviews, absolutely, right? Lit review, yep, definitely. Comparing to theses, right? Establishing a gap in scholarship, yes, right? So when we want students to do their own research, we want them to find that gap in the literature that they're going to answer with their research. But if they don't think about scholarship as conversation, they may really struggle with this idea of what the gap is and how to find it, right? Right. Annotated bibliography, absolutely. Anything where it doesn't have a clear or concrete answer, yes, completely. So students may struggle to do assignments like literature reviews, annotated bibliographies, any type of research assignment, right, where we're expecting them to dive into a topic where there isn't one clear answer, right? So if you've ever had students and you've given them, an annotated bibliography assignment and they just write summaries of each source and they don't connect those sources at all, right? That's showing that they have a lack of understanding of this idea of scholarship as conversation. They didn't recognize that one of the goals of the assignment was to put these sources in conversation with each other. And this can be a difficult topic, a difficult concept to grasp, right? I am in a graduate program myself now. And last semester, one of my fellow students said out loud in the middle of class, "Why have I never thought to put these sources in conversation with each other?" Right? That was an epiphany that he had as a graduate student, right? And so it can be really difficult if you haven't heard of this concept, if you're not familiar with it. A lot of the things that we ask students to do might not make much sense, right? Students who have Lee shared, students who have a hard time grasping this concept can't really develop a research question. Absolutely, right? They're not familiar with the conversation that has been taking place in the field. They don't know which questions have been asked. They don't know which questions haven't been answered. And so they really struggle to develop a focused research question. Completely agree, right? So without an understanding of this concept, there's a lot of things that our students might struggle with. And that's what the framework really tried to do. It really tried to highlight what are those things that experienced researchers understand, maybe without even realizing that they do, that influence our expectations for how students will perform, but that sometimes we don't talk about with them. Right? So scholarship as conversation is one of the 6 core concepts. I want to briefly talk about the other 5. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into detail about all of them. But just to briefly mention those, I have lots of resources related to each of these if you want to get into each of these concepts more deeply. So one of the concepts is authority is constructed and contextual. So this highlights the idea that experienced researchers recognize that information sources have different levels of authority, and that the context can really influence what is going to be considered authoritative or appropriate to use. So if you've ever had students who, maybe they've cited a website meant for children and you're like, that's not appropriate to use. They may not understand why, but that's because, in this particular context, certain types of sources are going to be considered authoritative while other types of sources are not. And they need to recognize what kinds of sources are going to be considered authoritative or appropriate in a particular context. Information creation as a process. Right. So this highlights that experienced researchers understand that information sources are created through a variety of different processes. They come in many different formats. And the format and the creation process can really impact why, how a source is valued or why a source might be considered authoritative or not. Like, why do we consider peer-reviewed articles to be generally more authoritative than other sources? Because we understand the process that goes into creating those sources, it goes into reviewing those sources, right? So we recognize that as a format of source that we consider to be generally authoritative. So those are 2 concepts. Information has value is a third. So experienced researchers understand that information has many different types of value. Can be value to the information creator. It can be value to the information consumer, right? And it can be financial value, but it doesn't have to be. But because information is valuable, we also recognize and understand that there are a lot of legal and ethical guidelines around how information is created and accessed and shared, right? So if you have students who struggle with why we put such an emphasis on citing sources, right? They may be struggling to understand the idea of the value of the information that they have. Research as inquiry. This is a really key one that's very closely connected with the scholarship as conversation idea. But as experienced researchers, we often think about research as this ongoing and open-ended, inquiry-driven process. So research is about asking questions, and we seek out the answers to those questions. We share those answers, but we know that the answer that we share is not going to likely be the final answer. We know that that's going to continue to lead to new questions. Others or scholars are going to build on our work as part of that scholarly conversation. So scholarship is conversation we already talked about. And then the last one is searching as strategic exploration. So, this highlights that, there are multiple different search tools, there are search strategies, search resources. Experienced researchers change their search based on the context. Whereas a novice learner might stick to a very tried and true set of search tools. So if you've ever had a student who used a database that you found that was inappropriate, and you ask, like, why did you use JSTOR? Well, that's the database that I learned how to use in high school, and that's the one that I'm going to use, right? And so not recognizing the vast array of other resources that might be able out there to search, and not knowing how to select the search tools that are appropriate for the context. So those are the 6 key concepts that are highlighted in the framework. And again, I have tons of resources on all of those that I'll share later in the slide. But I think the key point is, without an understanding of these key concepts, many of the tasks that we ask students to complete may not always make much sense, right? Because there's this gap. There's this gap between our understanding and their understanding of novices, as what the purpose is, what we're trying to ask them to do. And we may not always explicitly discuss these things with students just because they become so natural to us that we don't think to talk to them. We don't recognize that they don't think about scholarship as conversation, or that they're not familiar with why information is so valuable. So that's the quick overview of information literacy key concepts. Pause here really quickly to see if there are any questions that folks would like to share, or thoughts that they have on how this perspective on information literacy might differ from the perspective that they had coming in. So we'll pause here really quickly. And then we're going to move on in the next section and talk a little bit, try to connect this with some practices a little bit really quickly, and then share some activities. So again, please do go ahead and continue to share any thoughts that you have in the chat. We'll go ahead and move forward. So how do these concepts, these big concepts, connect to practice? So Alex shared the concept of what is authoritative is fluid in a given context. That's a new idea for me. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And that's, I think that is a real challenging concept to grasp. But if you get the idea of, why we don't want students to often cite Wikipedia, right? Not that Wikipedia can't be a great source of information, but within a particular context, it's not often, the scholarly context is not often considered to be an authoritative source for many reasons. And students might really struggle with that because the sources that they use in their everyday life, when they come to higher education, they may find that those sources aren't considered as valuable as, to their instructors. Yes, absolutely, Beth. The lack of research methods classes is problematic for students wanting to do research in those disciplines. Completely agree. And also, it's really interesting that you bring up that point that, what information literacy looks like is going to be a little bit different depending on the discipline, right? Within particular disciplines, certain types of sources are valued, certain types of research methods are valued, certain perspectives are valued. And so that's not always going to be the same. And students have to understand and think about what it means to be information literate within a particular discipline. Previously, I was thinking about information literacy as being critical of information, but it's a much broader concept. Absolutely, yeah. And I don't want to downplay the importance of critical evaluation of information. That is definitely a key part of information literacy. But I think it is a broader part of being able to evaluate information is understanding that broader context. Right? We can't effectively know whether something is going to be relevant or appropriate unless we understand these other concepts as well. Absolutely. Thanks so much for sharing those responses. Absolutely. So really quickly, we'll think about a few ways that we can connect this to some of the practices that we have students do. So I wanted to mention briefly this idea of learning bottlenecks. So if you're not familiar with this term, this comes from the Decoding the Disciplines model that was developed by Joan Middendorf and David Pace. But basically, learning bottlenecks are places in a course where students tend to struggle or get stuck. So those kind of places you see semester after semester, students are struggling with the same thing. And there are a lot of bottlenecks that may be specifically related to information literacy or a lack of information literacy. In the interest of time, I was going to have you all share some in the chat. In the interest of time, I'm going to share a few myself, but you can feel free to add if there are ones that you specifically see that you would like to talk about. Feel free to share those in the chat. Just wanted to highlight a few of the ones that I think are important. I did want to share this really quickly. This is a research process map that we developed at Ohio State that shows just how complex the research process can be. And even this is not an accurate understanding of how complex it could be. Like there should be arrows going off to the edge and going around, right? But all of these represent places where students might get stuck, right? So they might struggle to find the information that they need. They might struggle to evaluate it. They don't know how to use it accurately, right? They don't know what type of information they need, what's going to be appropriate in the particular context, where to go to find that information. There's so many places where students can get stuck as part of the research process. A few bottlenecks that I really want to highlight. First of all, I think that a lot of students just really struggle to understand what the expectations for research assignments are. There's been some research on this that students may approach research thinking that it's a process of compiling and summarizing information on a topic. And that can definitely be part of the research process. But in most cases, we want students to do more, right? We want them to ask a question or to identify a problem. And we want them to use the information, the sources that they find to help develop an answer, right? To solve a problem, to provide their own interpretation or argument. So in general, we want students to go beyond the process of just compiling information, but we want them to participate in the conversation, right? We want them to add their own perspective and voice. And that sometimes can be really hard. Students don't recognize that's what we're wanting them to do, or they may not think that they have anything that can actually contribute to the conversation themselves. So thinking of themselves as being capable of contributing to the conversation can be really challenging. I already mentioned this really quickly, but selecting search tools, students may only be familiar with a very limited number of search tools, may not be familiar with the range of tools that are appropriate or available to them. We have hundreds and hundreds of databases at Ohio State. How do they know which one to choose, which one's going to be most appropriate? That can be a real challenge. Evaluating information sources. We've already talked a little bit this, but struggling to identify sources that are credible, relevant, appropriate to the context. That can be really challenging, especially if students aren't familiar with these ideas of the authority being contextual, if they're not familiar with our understandings of why we think information is so valuable. If they're not familiar with different formats of information, this can be really challenging, right? We're at the point now where students find almost all of the information that they need online, and everything tends to look the same, right? So how can we can distinguish between a scholarly article, a news article, a blog post with relative ease. Even I struggle sometimes with is this a news article? Is this a blog post? But in general, we are familiar with and can see those distinctions. But those distinctions can be really hard for a novice learner to see. So how do you know if a source is appropriate if you don't even know what type of source it actually is, what the format of the source is? And then citing and using sources ethically, as we talked about, right? How to integrate their sources, why we are so insistent on citation. They may think of citation as primarily in terms of punishment. If I don't do this, I'm going to be punished, rather than seeing the value that we see in citations in terms of the scholarly conversation. We know that adding citations is necessary part of the scholarly conversation. It allows us to trace and navigate that conversation by having those citations. And if students don't have that, understanding of this ongoing scholarly conversation, they may not see that perspective. Right. So I'll pause there again, just to see if there are questions, comments, and then we'll move into some teaching strategies and activities for the last part of our workshop. All right. So best sure they need to find answers rather than reading to comprehend and analyze. Yes, absolutely. Rubrics and anonymous examples of submitted assignments has made a world of difference in a community college environment. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Thank you so much, Jill, for sharing. Absolutely. But providing examples and rubrics, yes, clarifying our expectations can be so valuable to students. All right, so some teaching strategies and activities that I want to highlight. Fortunately, we don't have time to get in depth in these different strategies, but one I wanted to mention, if you're not familiar with decoding the disciplines, this is something that I highly recommend that you check out. This is a model that was developed by Joan Middendorf and David Pace to help instructors think about what students are struggling with, and then to think about what might be causing that bottleneck, what might be, what is leading to them having difficulty with that, and thinking about their own process, how they go about solving that process, and identifying those places where maybe I'm not modeling this for students, or maybe I'm not sharing information that students need, not because I'm being malicious, but just because I didn't even realize that students don't understand this, right? Because it's become so tacit to me, it's become so familiar to me, right, that I may not even realize that students need a little bit extra guidance here. So based on this idea of decoding the disciplines, if you're working with students, if you're giving them research assignments, some of the questions that you can ask yourself, either as an instructor or librarian, to help kind of get to where they may be struggling, right? So, the student has the assignment that they need to go out to find 10 scholarly articles and do an annotated bibliography, right? Well, you ask yourself, how would I do this? And how do I know how to do this, right? What kinds of experience am I drawing on to be able to do this? What kinds of academic expertise, disciplinary expertise am I drawing on, right? First of all, I know what an annotated bibliography is, right? And students may not know that. I know where to go in my discipline to find articles, and students may not know that. I know how to, that the sources are supposed to be in conversation with each other. So thinking through each step, each task that we're asking students to do, and think, how would I know how to do this? How would I do this? And how would the students know how to do it? Would they know what to do here or not? Where do they need that guidance? What do they need to understand to be able to complete this task? So taking that time, that step back to look at our assignments, look at what we're asking students to do, and kind of decoding that for them. What is the actual process? What are the steps that they would have to take to get through this process? And this requires a lot of questioning of ourselves. In the actual decoding the disciplines model, they recommend doing like interviews with other people where they can continue to ask you questions about your process. So you have to get down to what it really is that you're doing, and you're not allowing yourself to skip steps that have become really familiar to you. So decoding the disciplines, great strategy for thinking about how we know what we know and what we may not be communicating with students. And then this pairs really well with the strategy of transparency in learning or teaching, or TILT, if folks are not familiar with the TILT framework. This is really a strategy for thinking about how we can be as transparent as possible about our expectations with students. And that goes back to the comment about providing examples and providing rubrics for students, right? So TILT has three main components. First, tell the students why they're doing this assignment, right? It may be very clear to you why they're doing that assignment, but they may not understand why they're doing it. So how is that assignment connected to other assignments in the course? How is it connected to the course goals, the program learning goals, what they're going to be doing after they graduate? Tell them why they're doing that assignment, and then tell them what to do. What are the tasks that students need to complete to be able to do this? Where should they get started? Which order should they proceed? What should they not do, right? If you've seen students making the same mistakes, telling them, hey, you're not going to do well if you start over here. Why don't we start over here? And then giving them examples, giving them criteria, telling them what is going to be the most important thing that you are focusing on, right? This is something where AI might be helpful for folks if we're thinking about how you can integrate AI. Having AI develop sample assignments that you could use to share as examples for students is one way that you could use AI. So combining decoding the disciplines with transparency in learning and teaching, I think is really helpful. We found really helpful for helping instructors, helping ourselves as librarians think about what are we really asking students to do here, and how can we clarify our expectations for students. And I've got tons of resources and TILT and decoding at the end. Agents up in conversation. All right, let me make sure. Unspoken bottleneck is that it takes time. There are no shortcuts. Yes, talking to students just about recognizing, yes, this is a difficult process. I gave a workshop for graduate students the other day, and one of the things I said was, this is really hard. Like, it's okay. It's okay if you're struggling because this is really hard. They may think that they're the only one who doesn't get it. And it's perfectly okay to say, this takes time. It can be a big struggle. It's hard to do, and that's totally okay. Absolutely. So some activities and resources I want to share. I'll get to that question at the end if that's okay, Donna. Yeah. All right, so some teaching activities. One activity that I find that we do a lot is what we call interpreting a research assignment. Fortunately, we don't have time to do this activity ourselves, but just to kind of show you what it would look like is, so this is a sample assignment. So what you would have students do whenever you give them a research assignment, you could have them go out and take some time and take a look at that assignment. And they can do things like highlight any terms that you don't understand, underline the action verbs. So the verbs that tell you what you're supposed to be doing, analyze, evaluate, those kinds of verbs, right? And have them, work together, work individually, identify, what are the things that they think that they're supposed to be doing with that assignment, and then have them tell you that, right? So give that information back to you. You tell me what you think you're supposed to be doing, right? What do I want you to do with this? Why do I want you to do this? Right? Have them give you that information. And that's a great way where you can get at the things that students are not understanding, right? You may use a term like scholarly source, and then you think that's understandable. But students may all highlight that and say, hey, we're not really sure what scholarly sources are. And that gives you time to give that feedback right away to students to help them understand what your expectations are. So taking 10, 15 minutes when you give students an assignment like this, having them do this interpreting activity, giving you that feedback right away, lets you know those places where they may be struggling and may need additional guidance. If students are reluctant to share, it's something they could do anonymously, right? It could be for credit or not, depending on your context, but it gives you that feedback that you need to know when students might be struggling. I use a lot of true false activities, and they seem really basic, but I would do something like, here's 5 statements on the purpose of a literature review. Tell me whether or not these statements are true or false. And that I would always get such good feedback from students, where they would highlight, well, we don't know if this is true or false, right? And then we can have that conversation. This is what the purpose of a literature review is. Or give them 5 statements about how do you evaluate sources. You evaluate sources by considering the domain name. And I would say, no, that doesn't really help. Those kinds of things. So really simple, really basic, it seems like, but I have found true false activities to be so helpful in my teaching and getting to the bottlenecks or the places where students may struggle to understand. And it's easier for them to share in this kind of context things that they, instead of just asking them, what don't you understand? This kind of gets to that understanding. Along the similar lines, self-explaining activities. We use these a lot as well. So for example, in one course we teach, we have students do search screencasts, where we give them a task and they go out and record themselves doing a search and talk through their search. And that gives us an opportunity to hear what they're thinking, why they're doing certain things and why they're not doing certain things. And then we can give feedback to them right away. It doesn't have to be a video. You can do this verbally, you can do this in writing, but have students give them a task and say, how would you complete this task? And then just let them tell you what they would do. And that gives you that chance to say, hey, maybe you might go off course here. Let's think about maybe a better direction that we could go with this type of assignment. So any type of self-explaining where they're having to think through their process of how they would do that can be really helpful. So I've got lots of examples. All of these are links to examples that you can use and share for how to do these. Defining activities. So having students do something like, let's talk about what it means to think of scholarship as conversation. Initially, what do they think that term might mean? And a lot of them may have really no understanding of what that term might mean. And then share some resources with them. I have videos, I have online guides. Have them try to define that concept first, share some resources, talk about it in class, and then have them define that concept again. And, obviously, these kinds of things are understandings that aren't always going to be developed right away. It may take multiple times where you're talking students to really kind of get some of these concepts. But starting to help them develop these understandings of some of these unspoken expectations that they may be encountering. Minute thesis activity. This can be really helpful for something like connecting a concept to a practice, right? So if you want students to understand the idea that information has value, you could give them some related practices or concepts like plagiarism. How is plagiarism connected to information has value? And they have to write one sentence connecting those two concepts, right? How is copyright connected to the idea of information has value? Write one sentence connecting those two concepts. So they're starting to make those connections between practice and concept. So there's different ways that you can do that. I have some different examples of minute thesis activities that you can use. And then I wanted to highlight, I think this is the last sort of kind of activity. But if you're thinking about evaluating sources, as we mentioned, is really key. I really highlight and I encourage folks to use the lateral reading strategy of evaluating sources, which is where we encourage students whether to spend a lot of time looking at the specific source itself, they go out and find out other information about that source. So, who the author of that source is, what the organization of that source is. They open multiple tabs, they do additional Google searches, Wikipedia searches. So they find out the credibility of the source, less by looking at the specific source itself, but then by kind of seeing where that source fits in the broader information universe. So I have a lot of resources on that as well. And apologies that we don't have a lot of time to get into a lot of these resources. I do have other workshops that are specifically focused on some of these concepts. So if you're interested, I have a Decoding the Disciplines workshop coming up, for example. But this is kind of a big picture overview of sharing of resources and ideas. A few resources that I do want to highlight that are available to folks. I did put the link to these in the chat. I'm going to try to see if I can get these in one more time. We have at Ohio State a teaching, research, and information literacy page here. And that is the link there. That's one of the links in there. And on this page, you can see we have resources on search tools and strategies, research questions, types of information sources, source evaluation, ethical information use. In each of these categories, then we have relevant readings that you can use. We have videos that you can use, and then sample activities as well. So we curated these resources from a lot of different locations. Some are Ohio State material, some are from other folks. But resources, activities, readings that you can use to help students, as you're thinking about teaching some of these concepts, kind of ready-made that you can incorporate into your classes there. Another resource that I really want to highlight, and these are for if you're an Ohio State person especially, we have ready-made modules that can be added to a Canvas course. You can see some of the different concepts and topics: annotated bibliography, literature review, how to search academic search complete, building a search strategy, citation tracing. These are fully made modules that you can download into your Canvas course. You can modify as needed and use those and have those resources available to you. So I highly recommend that you take a look at those and request any ones that you think are relevant. You can also let us know if there's ones that you think would be helpful that we don't have. If you're not at Ohio State, you can look at these modules, but you would not be able to download them, unfortunately, into a course. But we could share a PDF version of the module if that would be helpful to you. So we have Canvas modules for students. We also have some modules for instructors. So if there's any of these concepts that you want to learn about yourself more, we have some modules that you could take in Canvas if you were interested. I have tons of information literacy videos and resources that have been created. So I have videos on all of the framework concepts, that are very short. They're 1 to 2 minute videos meant to really just get a introduction to that concept as a way to get students thinking about that concept. I created a bunch of online guides to each of these concepts. So we'll take a look at one really quickly. So if you want students to learn more about authority as constructed and contextual, I have a quick online guide here that has an introduction to the concept, what it means, concept description, some of the key practices, and some of the key dispositions associated with that concept. So pretty basic, but just really helpful kind of online guides that you can use to help students understand some of these concepts. And if you're a librarian, please feel free to share these resources with the instructors on your campus as well. These are open for anyone to use. So please feel free to take those and share those with anyone that you think might find them helpful. We have another online page on our Teaching and Learning Resource Center on information literacy concepts and teaching strategies that has understandings of these concepts, activities, learning bottlenecks, all of those there as well. So lots of resources out there that are available. I wanted to highlight just a few. Last thing I wanted to mention really quickly is our online textbook, Choosing and Using Sources, a Guide to Academic Research. This is open source, openly accessed, and available to anyone, Ohio State or outside of Ohio State, to use in their classes. So please take a look at that resource as well. All right. So we have like 1 minute left. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to go ahead and share this in the chat. I do have several upcoming workshops scheduled. I'll share the information in this in a follow-up email with everyone, but would love to see folks at a future workshop as well. So I will go ahead and pause here. I will stick around for a few more minutes in case folks do have questions or comments that they would like to share. Otherwise, please take a look at those resources. Please share any of those resources that you find are relevant. Use them. And hope to see you again at a future workshop.